She thought he was just a stranger who paid for her train ticket, but when the Millionaire CEO stood up from his seat, her life changed in a way she could never have imagined. The station was alive with the restless energy of winter travel. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it a biting cold that turned breath into pale clouds. Inside, the warmth of the waiting hall was mixed with the smell of coffee from a small kiosk and the metallic scent of damp coats drying in the heat. People moved in every direction, dragging suitcases, clutching paper cups, calling out to one another. Amid all this movement, Laura Williams sat almost motionless on a hard wooden bench near the ticket counter, her arms wrapped protectively around her 6-year-old son. Daniel was a small boy with soft, dark hair that curled slightly beneath the edge of his bright yellow beanie. His dark eyes darted from the crowd to his mother's face, sensing the tension she tried so hard to hide. She held a worn leather wallet in her hands, flipping through the few crumpled bills and scattered coins inside. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the weight of the moment. Laura stood and approached the ticket counter, Daniel close at her side. "2 tickets to Maplewood, please," she said, her voice steady but quiet. The ticket clerk, a tired-looking woman with a pinched expression, tapped at her computer and gave the total. Laura counted her coins again, her heart sinking as the reality became clear. She was short, not by much, but enough to make the clerk's expression harden. "I'm sorry, I can't pay the full amount," Laura whispered, glancing quickly over her shoulder at the line forming behind her. "I'm just a couple of dollars short. Could you—" The woman shook her head sharply. "Rules are rules, ma'am. I can't sell you the tickets unless you have the full amount." Laura's stomach knotted. She felt Daniel tug gently at her sleeve, his voice small. "Mom, what's wrong?" She smiled weakly at him as if it were nothing, but inside a wave of helplessness crashed over her. The train would be leaving soon, and without those tickets they would be stuck here with nowhere to go. It was then that she felt it, a gaze from across the room, steady and unyielding. Laura turned slightly and saw him. He was sitting alone in the far corner of the waiting area, a tall man in a perfectly tailored black overcoat, one leg crossed over the other, a folded newspaper in his hand. His hair was a rich chestnut brown, neatly combed back, and his eyes, deep brown, sharp and observant, were fixed on her. There was something about him that made him stand out from the crowd, something beyond his striking looks. He carried himself with the ease of someone who belonged in boardrooms and luxury hotels, not on the cold benches of a train station. For a moment their eyes met, and Laura felt as if he could see right through her, past the smile she forced for Daniel, past the calm tone she tried to keep. The man lowered his newspaper, his gaze lingering on the small boy holding her hand. Then without hesitation he rose from his seat. His footsteps were deliberate, the click of polished shoes against the tile cutting through the noise of the station. People instinctively moved aside as he approached, as though sensing his presence before they even saw him. He stopped beside her at the counter, his height casting a shadow over the space between them. "How much are you short?" His voice was deep, calm, with a quiet authority that made the ticket clerk straighten in her chair. Laura blinked, startled. $2, she said softly, almost ashamed. She wasn't used to accepting help, especially from strangers. Especially from strangers like him. The man reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew not $2, but a crisp $100 bill. Without a word, he placed it on the counter. "2 tickets to Maplewood," he told the clerk, "and give her the change." Laura stared at him, stunned. I, I can't take this," she protested, but he simply looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read. "Take it," he said, his gaze shifting briefly to Daniel, "and buy something warm for the boy." Before she could find the right words, the tickets were printed, the change handed over, and the man had already stepped back, giving her a faint nod before turning to leave. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't ask for her name. He simply disappeared into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Laura holding the tickets in one hand and Daniel's small fingers in the other, her heart racing with confusion and a strange, unfamiliar hope. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, a fleeting encounter at a train station, was about to change everything. Laura sat on the worn train seat, Daniel pressed close to her side, his little hands wrapped around a paper cup of hot cocoa she had bought with the change the stranger had given her. The cup steamed in the chill of the carriage, its faint chocolate scent mixing with the smell of metal and cold fabric. Outside, the night had deepened, and the train windows showed only blackness, broken by the occasional flicker of passing lights. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks was almost soothing, but Laura's mind was far from calm. She couldn't stop thinking about him. The man in the black overcoat, with eyes like polished mahogany, the one who had stepped in without hesitation. There had been something about his presence that unsettled her, but not in a threatening way. More like he had shifted the air around him, bending the moment to his will. Men like that didn't just wander into your life on a freezing night at a train station, and they certainly didn't hand strangers $100 without expecting something in return. Daniel leaned against her, his voice muffled against her coat. "Mom, was he a good guy?" Laura hesitated, looking down at her son's earnest face. "I think so," she said finally, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "He helped us when we needed it. That's what matters." She tried to keep her tone light, but the question lingered in her mind. Who was he? The train swayed gently, and Laura closed her eyes for a moment, exhaustion washing over her. The last few weeks had been a blur of late-night shifts, frantic calls to landlords, and growing hospital bills. Every dollar had gone into keeping them afloat. This trip to Maplewood was supposed to be a new start. Her sister had promised them a place to stay until she could find work. But even that plan had nearly collapsed tonight. Just as her thoughts began to drift, a shadow passed outside the glass. A figure in the reflection moved down the aisle toward them. Laura's pulse quickened. It was him, the man from the station. He walked with the same deliberate steps, as if the narrow train aisle was just another hallway he owned. He stopped at the empty seat across from her, setting a sleek leather briefcase at his feet before lowering himself into the chair. The small table between them seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. "I didn't expect to see you again," Laura said, her voice low. He smiled faintly, though it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "I had business in Maplewood. We're on the same train." His tone was casual, but there was a precision to his words that made Laura feel as though each one was chosen deliberately. Daniel's eyes widened. "You're the man who bought our tickets." The stranger looked at the boy, and for a moment, his face softened. "That's right," he said. "I don't like seeing people stranded, especially kids." Laura shifted slightly in her seat, uncertain. "Why did you help us? You didn't even know our names." He tilted his head, studying her. "Not everything needs a reason, but if it makes you feel better, I saw a mother doing everything she could to protect her son. That was enough." There was a pause. The sound of the train filled the space between them. Then, almost as an afterthought, he extended his hand across the table. "Michael Reed." His handshake was firm, his palm warm despite the cold air in the carriage. Laura hesitated before taking it. "Laura Williams, and this is my son, Daniel." Michael nodded at Daniel. "You like hot chocolate?" Daniel grinned, nodding enthusiastically. Michael reached into his coat and pulled out a small, perfectly wrapped chocolate bar, placing it on the table. "For the journey," he said simply. Laura wanted to refuse, wanted to keep some distance between herself and this man whose life was clearly so far from hers. But the sparkle in Daniel's eyes made her swallow her protest. For the rest of the ride, conversation came in fragments. Michael asked about Maplewood, about the places Laura remembered from her childhood. He didn't pry about why she had left or why she was coming back now, but something in his questions told her he already suspected more than she was saying. When the train finally began to slow, the lights of Maplewood glowing faintly in the distance, Michael stood and lifted his briefcase. "Good luck, Laura," he said, meeting her eyes one last time. "And take care of your boy." Before she could reply, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of passengers moving toward the doors. Laura sat there for a moment, Daniel's small hand in hers, wondering if she'd ever see him again. She didn't know that this was only the beginning, that his sudden reappearance in her life was not a coincidence, but the start of something that would test them both in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The streets of Maplewood were coated in a fresh layer of snow that crunched under Laura's boots as she walked. Daniel's mittened hand tucked securely in hers. The icy wind cut across her cheeks, turning them pink, and her breath came out in small clouds that hung briefly in the air before fading away. She had forgotten how bitter the winters here could be. The glow of street lamps cast long shadows on the sidewalk, the snow reflecting the golden light in a way that made everything look both familiar and strangely foreign. Her sister's apartment was 3 blocks from the station, tucked above a bakery that smelled of warm bread, even in the cold night. Laura had been expecting a warm welcome, but when the door opened, her sister's smile faltered. The small one-bedroom was already cramped with her own two children and a husband who didn't say much beyond a tight-lipped hello. Laura understood instantly. They weren't planning on her staying long. By the time Daniel was asleep on the couch under a borrowed blanket, Laura lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a film she couldn't switch off. Michael Reed. His eyes, his voice, his deliberate way of looking at her, as if he saw past the surface. She had been around wealthy men before, but there was something about him that didn't fit the mold. He hadn't flaunted his money. He had used it without hesitation, but without show. And still, she couldn't figure out why he had chosen her. The next morning, Laura stepped outside to get some fresh air while her sister's kids argued over breakfast. The snow was falling again, slow and heavy, blanketing the sidewalks in silence. She crossed the street toward the cafe on the corner, hoping for a quiet moment to collect her thoughts. The bell over the cafe door chimed as she entered, and warmth enveloped her. The scent of fresh coffee and pastries was almost intoxicating. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a small tea, and took a seat near the window. Daniel had stayed with her sister, still drowsy from the night before. She was halfway through her tea when the door opened again. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. She felt it before she saw him. That subtle shift in the air, the same sensation she had felt at the train station. Michael Reed stepped inside, brushing snow from his black overcoat, scanning the room briefly before his gaze locked on her. For a second, she thought he might pass by, that this was just another coincidence. But instead, he crossed the room and stopped at her table. "May I?" he asked, indicating the seat across from her. Laura hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." He sat down, resting his briefcase beside him, and ordered a coffee without even glancing at the menu. "I didn't expect to run into you so soon," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I could say the same," Laura replied, wrapping her hands around her cup. "Are you following me?" He raised an eyebrow. "If I were, I'd be doing a terrible job. Maplewood isn't that big, and you're hard to miss." The comment caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, but the waitress arrived with his coffee, setting it down with a smile that lingered a little too long. Michael ignored it, his eyes never leaving Laura's. "What are you doing here?" she asked finally. "Business," he said simply. "I have a few properties here, and a meeting later this afternoon." He took a sip of his coffee, then leaned forward slightly. "But that's not why I'm talking to you." Her pulse quickened. "Then why are you?" He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Because you look like someone who could use a break. Last night wasn't just about buying train tickets. I see a woman who's fighting harder than she should have to. I've been in situations where one small push changed everything. I thought maybe I could be that push for you." Laura let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You don't even know me." "Not yet," he said, his tone quiet but certain. There was something dangerous in the way he said it. Not dangerous in the sense of harm, but in the sense that he might make her believe him. Before she could find the right words, he reached into his coat and slid a small white card across the table. "If you ever need something, anything, call me." The card was heavy, expensive paper, with his name and a single phone number embossed in black. She stared at it, unsure if taking it would mean accepting something she wasn't ready for. But in the end, she slipped it into her pocket. Michael stood, buttoning his coat. "Enjoy your tea, Laura." Then he was gone, leaving her sitting there with the weight of that card burning against her side. She didn't know it yet, but that meeting in the cafe would be the thread that began to pull apart the tightly wound life she had built and unravel it into something entirely new. The day after their second encounter in the cafe, Laura tried to focus on finding some kind of work. She could not rely on the hospitality of her sister's cramped apartment for long, and the idea of owing Michael Reed anything, even in the form of a favor, made her uneasy. Still, his business card burned in her pocket like a live ember. She spent the morning walking from shop to shop, asking if they were hiring, but every door seemed to close in her face. The local grocery store had no openings. The small bookstore near the park could only offer weekend hours for a wage that wouldn't even cover rent. By noon, the snow had turned into a wet slush, soaking through the thin soles of her boots. She ducked into the public library to warm up, sitting in a quiet corner where Daniel could read while she searched job postings on a communal computer. It was almost closing time when her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something in her gut told her to pick up. "Laura!" The voice was unmistakable. "Michael." Her stomach tightened. "How did you get my number?" "You left it when you filled out that ticket refund form at the station last night," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I was calling because I heard something I think you need to know." She frowned. "And what's that?" There was a pause, then his voice lowered. "Your sister's landlord is about to raise the rent. She didn't want to tell you because she knows you have nowhere else to go, but it means she's going to ask you to leave sooner than you expect." Laura's fingers tightened around the phone. "Why would you even know that?" "I know people in this town," he said simply, "and I don't think you should be blindsided." He hesitated for a moment. "Meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. Same cafe. Bring Daniel." She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him she didn't need his interference. But something about his tone, calm but firm, made her realize he wasn't asking. And deep down, she knew she needed help. The next morning, the cafe was warm and bright, the windows fogged from the heat inside. Michael was already there, seated at the same table as before, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He rose when she walked in, greeting Daniel with a polite nod before pulling out a chair for Laura. "I'm not here to accept charity," she began before even sitting down. He smiled faintly. "Good. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering an opportunity." She narrowed her eyes. "What kind of opportunity?" He reached into his briefcase and placed a folder on the table. Inside were several documents: a rental agreement, photographs of a modest but well-kept two-bedroom apartment, and a letter from a property management company. "It's one of my places. It's been empty for months. You can live there for a fraction of what you'd pay anywhere else. And you can work part-time at one of my businesses until you find something better." Laura felt a rush of heat in her cheeks. "Why would you do this for me? For us?" Michael leaned forward, his brown eyes steady on hers. "Because I can. And because I believe in investing in people, not just buildings. You strike me as someone who doesn't give up, even when it would be easier to. That's worth something." She glanced at Daniel, who was sipping hot chocolate, blissfully unaware of the weight of the conversation. Her son's cheeks were flushed from the cold, and she noticed how small and fragile he looked in that moment. The thought of giving him a real home again, even temporarily, was almost too much to process. But something about Michael's offer unsettled her. Not because it seemed dishonest, but because it seemed too deliberate, as if he had made up his mind about her before she even had a chance to decide for herself. Still, when she finally looked up, her voice was quiet. "I'll think about it." He nodded as if he'd expected that. "Good, but don't think too long. Opportunities have a way of disappearing if you wait." As they left the cafe, Laura felt the cold bite of the wind again, but this time it didn't sting as much. She had no idea yet that this meeting was not simply about a place to live. It was the first step in Michael weaving himself into her life in a way she wouldn't be able to untangle. Laura didn't sleep much the night after her meeting with Michael. She lay in the narrow bed beside Daniel, staring at the cracked ceiling of her sister's apartment, listening to the sound of traffic far below. The idea of accepting a stranger's offer, especially a man like him, with his wealth, his confidence, his unsettling ability to anticipate her needs, felt dangerous. And yet the alternative was even worse. She could already sense her sister's patience wearing thin. The apartment was too small, the bills too high, and two extra people were too much for a household already on the edge. By morning, Laura had made her decision. She called Michael from the stairwell before Daniel woke up, her voice steady but guarded. "I'll take the apartment," she said simply. "Good," Michael replied, as if he had been expecting her call. "Meet me at noon. I'll hand you the keys." The building was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of some gleaming modern structure, it was an old red brick walk-up with ivy climbing the side and tall windows that caught the winter light. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and fresh paint. The apartment itself was small but warm. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, and the kitchen, though modest, was spotless. Two bedrooms. Real bedrooms. She could almost hear Daniel's laughter echoing off the walls. "This is more than I expected," she admitted, turning in a slow circle. Michael, leaning against the doorframe, smiled faintly. I don't do halfway measures. Laura glanced at him, trying to read his expression. And the rent? He named a figure so low her breath caught. It was less than half of what she'd seen anywhere else. That's, generous, she murmured. Not generosity, he corrected. Practicality. I'd rather rent to someone who will take care of the place than leave it empty. He handed her a set of keys. You can move in immediately. As for work, I have an opening at one of my cafes. Flexible hours, decent pay. You can start next week. She wanted to protest, to tell him she hadn't agreed to work for him, but the truth was she needed the job. I don't know anything about running a cafe, she said. You'll learn, he replied without hesitation. You strike me as someone who learns quickly. That night, she and Daniel moved into the apartment. Michael had arranged for basic furniture, a bed for each of them, a table and chairs, a worn but comfortable couch, without her even asking. It was both a relief and a warning. He seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. The first week at the cafe was a blur. It was a small, cozy place on a busy corner with a constant stream of customers. Laura learned to pour perfect lattes, wipe down tables, handle the register. The other employees were friendly enough, though she caught more than one of them watching her curiously, as if wondering why the boss had hired her personally. Michael stopped by more often than she expected. Sometimes he ordered coffee, sometimes he just stood near the counter, speaking quietly to the manager before catching Laura's eye and giving her a small nod. It was never long, but it was always enough to remind her he was watching, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made it impossible to forget the power he held over her life now. One evening after closing, Laura found him waiting outside the cafe. Snow was falling in soft, slow flakes, settling on his dark coat. How's it going? He asked. Better than I thought, she admitted. It feels good to be working again. He studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. I'm glad. You're capable of more than you think, Laura. This, he gestured to the cafe behind her, is just the beginning. Something in his tone made her uneasy, though she couldn't say why. It was as if he had plans for her she didn't yet understand. That night, as she tucked Daniel into bed, she tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, quiet and persistent, like a shadow stretching across the floor. Michael had given her a home, a job, stability, things she had been desperate for. But in the silence of her new apartment, Laura couldn't help but wonder what he expected in return. Laura had been working at the cafe for nearly a month when she began to notice the little patterns in Michael's appearances. He never came in on Mondays. On Tuesdays, he appeared just after lunch, staying only long enough to exchange a few quiet words with the manager and inevitably to glance at her. Wednesdays and Thursdays, he was absent entirely. But Fridays were different. He always came in just before closing, when the crowd thinned and the air smelled of coffee grounds and warm pastries. He would stand at the counter, order a black coffee, and linger in conversation until the staff began stacking chairs. At first, Laura told herself it was coincidence, but the more she thought about it, the more deliberate it seemed. She started to sense that Michael's visits weren't just about checking the cafe, they were about checking on her. One Friday evening, when the last customer had left and the espresso machine was cooling, Michael appeared as expected. He was dressed more casually than usual. No suit, no tie, just a dark sweater and a heavy coat dusted with snowflakes. He leaned against the counter while she wiped it down. You've adapted quickly, he said. The customers like you. She shrugged, keeping her eyes on the cloth in her hand. It's just coffee. It's never just coffee, he replied. It's a reason people come back. And people come back for you. Laura felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look up. Is that why you keep coming back? There was a pause, too long to be casual. Partly, he said at last, his tone even. But I also like to make sure things are running smoothly. She set down the cloth, meeting his gaze. You mean you like to make sure I'm running smoothly? His lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes didn't soften. Maybe. You've been through a lot. People in your position sometimes falter. The remark stung, though she couldn't say why. I'm not going to fall apart, Michael. I hope not. He sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. I'd hate to see you lose what you've built so far. Something in his voice, the way it balanced encouragement and warning, unsettled her. She changed the subject, asking about some of the regular customers. But Michael didn't follow the diversion. Instead, he studied her, as though weighing whether to say more. Finally, he set his coffee down. "I'm having a dinner next week, a small gathering at my house. I'd like you to come." Laura blinked. "Me? Why?" "You'll meet people. The kind of people who might help you in ways you haven't considered yet." She hesitated. The idea of stepping into Michael's world, the world of power, money, and influence he seemed to navigate so easily, made her uneasy. "I'm not sure I'd fit in." "You'll be fine," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Bring Daniel if you want. I'll send a car." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. After closing, Laura walked home with Daniel through the falling snow, her mind heavy with questions. Why was he inviting her into his private circle? Was this just kindness, or was there something else at play? The following week, the cafe was busy, but Laura couldn't stop thinking about the invitation. On Thursday, she stayed late, helping the manager reconcile the till. When she finally left, the street outside was quiet, lit by the pale glow of street lamps. That was when she saw him. Michael standing across the street, speaking to a man in a dark overcoat. They were too far away for her to hear the words, but the tone was sharp, the gestures controlled, but tense. The man handed Michael a small envelope, and Michael slipped it into his coat without looking inside. When the man walked away, Michael turned, and for a moment, his eyes locked with hers across the snow-dusted street. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there watching her until a passing car broke the line of sight. When the car moved on, he was gone. That night, Laura lay awake. The image of the envelope burned into her mind. She had accepted his help, his generosity, his job. But for the first time, she began to wonder what kind of man she had let into her life. Laura stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of the simple navy dress she had chosen. It wasn't new. In fact, she'd worn it to a job interview years ago. But it was the best she had, and it felt safe. She had no idea what kind of people would be at Michael's dinner, only that they would probably be nothing like her. Daniel sat on the couch, tugging at the sleeves of his little sweater, his expression somewhere between curiosity and reluctance. The black sedan Michael promised arrived precisely on time, its glossy frame reflecting the falling snow. The driver, a tall man in a dark coat, greeted them politely and opened the door. Inside, the car was warm, the seats soft leather, and the silence heavy. Laura kept her gaze on the streets outside as the city gave way to quieter neighborhoods. The houses growing larger, the driveways longer. Finally, the car turned onto a private road lined with tall trees, their branches weighed down by fresh snow. Michael's house was nothing short of stunning, a sprawling modern structure of glass and stone, glowing warmly in the winter night. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something rich and savory from the kitchen. The living room alone was larger than her entire apartment, with high ceilings and soft lighting that made the whole space feel like something out of a magazine. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair slightly tousled in a way that seemed intentional. "You made it," he said with that same measured smile he always wore, one that seemed both welcoming and guarded. "Come in. Meet everyone." The guests were already mingling in the main room. Men in expensive suits, women in elegant gowns, champagne glasses in their hands. Conversations were quiet, punctuated by polite laughter, but there was an underlying sharpness in the air, the kind that came from people used to negotiating deals worth millions. Michael introduced Laura and Daniel to a few people. She caught the way some of them looked at her, curious, assessing, as though trying to determine who she was and why she was there. Daniel clung to her hand at first, but soon found himself distracted by the dessert table. At one point, Michael guided Laura to a quieter corner near the fireplace. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "A little out of place," she admitted. "That's normal. Just remember, you're here because I want you here, and because I think you should start seeing what's possible for you." Before she could ask what he meant, a man approached. He was tall, with a silver streak in his dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Michael," he said with a smooth voice, "introduce me to your guest." "This is Laura," Michael said. "Laura, this is Richard Bennett." Richard's handshake was firm but not warm. "I've heard your name," he said, glancing briefly at Michael. Interesting. Laura didn't know what to say to that, and Michael didn't offer any explanation. Instead, Richard smiled faintly, excused himself, and melted back into the crowd. Dinner was served at a long, gleaming table, the kind you only see in movies. Course after course arrived, food so delicate and beautifully arranged that Laura hesitated before eating it. Conversation flowed around her, much of it about investments, markets, and properties in cities she'd never visited. Michael was at the head of the table, perfectly in control, his presence commanding without being loud. Halfway through the meal, Laura noticed Richard leaning toward Michael, speaking in a low voice. Michael's expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped once against the stem of his wineglass. Something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. After dessert, Michael invited a smaller group, including Laura, into his study. The walls were lined with books and photographs, and in one corner stood a massive antique globe. The atmosphere was different here, quieter but also more intense. "Laura," Michael said, gesturing for her to sit, "I want you to meet a few people who might be helpful in your situation." Helpful. The word struck her oddly. She wasn't sure if this was about charity, opportunity, or something else entirely. The people in the room smiled politely, but their questions were probing. About her work, her past, her plans for the future. It felt less like conversation and more like an interview she hadn't agreed to. When the evening finally ended and the car pulled away from Michael's house, Laura sat in silence, Daniel asleep beside her. Her mind was tangled with impressions. The beauty of the house, the intensity of the people, the strange undercurrent in Michael's interactions. But one image refused to leave her. The moment when Richard said he'd heard of her. She had no idea what that meant, and she couldn't shake the suspicion that Michael knew exactly what it meant, but had chosen not to tell her. The snow fell heavier as they drove through the quiet streets, and for the first time Laura wondered if accepting Michael's invitation had brought her closer to safety, or to something far more dangerous. The days after the dinner at Michael's house felt strangely quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that sat heavy in Laura's chest, like the air before a storm. She couldn't stop replaying moments from that night. Richard's piercing gaze, the murmured conversation between him and Michael, the way people seemed to already know something about her that she didn't know herself. Daniel was back to his usual cheerful self, chattering about school and drawing pictures of snow-covered houses, but Laura felt as if she were living in two worlds at once. One where she was just a single mother trying to make ends meet, and another where she was being pulled into a reality that belonged to men in tailored suits and rooms filled with unspoken deals. 3 days later, she received a message from Michael. It was short. "We need to talk, tonight. My driver will pick you up." There was no explanation, no warmth, just that. The same black sedan arrived as before, but this time, instead of heading to his house, it drove them toward the edge of the city. Snowflakes streaked the windows, and Laura felt her heartbeat quicken as the streets grew emptier. Finally, they stopped in front of a tall glass building that gleamed against the dark sky. Inside, the lobby was silent, the lighting dim. Michael was waiting for her on the top floor, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. He didn't smile when she walked in. His posture was straighter, his eyes sharper, as though he'd shed the softer edges he sometimes showed her. "Laura," he began, motioning for her to sit. "There's something I should have told you sooner." Her hands tightened on her bag. "You're scaring me." "I'm not trying to scare you, but after the other night, I realized you need to understand the situation you're in." "The situation I'm in?" she echoed, her voice rising. "Michael, I don't even know what this is. You keep showing up, helping me, introducing me to people I don't know, and now you're—" He cut her off, his tone calm but firm. "Richard Bennett is not just an acquaintance, he's a competitor. And the fact that he recognized you was unexpected." She blinked, confused. "Recognized me? I've never met him." Michael's jaw tightened. "Not directly, but you may have crossed paths with people connected to him without realizing it. I believe your late ex-husband worked for a company under his control." Her breath caught. She had avoided speaking about her ex-husband for years. The man had been unreliable, careless with money, and absent more often than not. But she never imagined he had any connection to people like Michael or Richard. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. More than you think, Michael said. When your ex disappeared from the picture, certain documents and accounts tied to him went missing. Richard thinks you might have them, or know where they are. He's wrong, but that won't stop him from looking. A cold shiver ran down her spine. I don't have anything. I know, Michael said, his gaze steady, but he doesn't care. And now that he's seen you, you've become part of a game you never agreed to play. The words hung between them like smoke. Laura's mind raced. The stares at the dinner, the loaded questions, the way Richard had studied her face. She thought of Daniel, of the small, fragile life they had built, and the idea that any of this could put him in danger made her stomach twist. So what happens now, she asked. Michael stepped closer, his voice low. Now, you stay close to me. You don't meet with anyone I don't approve of. You don't answer questions about your past. And if Richard tries to approach you, you call me immediately. Her instinct was to push back, to tell him she could handle herself, but the truth was she couldn't. Not against men like Richard Bennett. For a moment, the hardness in Michael's eyes softened. Laura, I didn't plan to get involved in this, but I'm not going to let him use you or hurt you. Something in his tone, the quiet certainty, both reassured her and unsettled her. It wasn't just protection he was offering, it was possession. When she left the building that night, the snow was falling heavier, coating the streets in a quiet white blanket. The city lights blurred through the glass as the car drove her home, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that nothing in her life would ever be simple again. She thought about the man in the charcoal suit who had stepped into her world that day at the station, the one who had paid for her ticket without asking anything in return. Now she realized that everything had a price, even kindness. And whatever Michael's price was, she was already paying it, piece by piece. But deep inside, beneath the fear, there was also a flicker of something else, a strange, unwelcome thrill at the thought of what might come next. Because Michael had made it clear, this was only the beginning. In the end, what strikes me most about this story is how fate can weave people's lives together in the most unexpected ways. What began as a moment of despair on a cold train platform became the turning point that healed more than one broken heart. The Millionaire CEO was not just a man with wealth. He was a man who had known loss, loneliness, and silence for far too long. The single mother was not just a woman struggling to survive. She was a warrior, fighting for her child's future with every ounce of strength she had left. Their meeting was not simply about charity or kindness. It was about recognition. They saw in each other the pain, the resilience, and the quiet longing for something better. That's why the ending feels so powerful. Not because it's happy in a cliché sense, but because it's proof that hope can come from the most unexpected of places, and that sometimes a single act of compassion can rewrite an entire life story. If you'd like, I can also make a short, emotional afterword that would perfectly close your book and leave readers in tears. Do you want me to do that?